The Apache girl was left in the river to drown until he walked in without a word. The river had no name on any map. It wound through the canyon like a half-remembered ghost, choked with silt and shadow, its waters sluggish and opaque beneath the weight of the coming dusk. Here, in this forgotten bend where the cottonwoods leaned like weary sentinels, and the air held the bitter tang of damp stone and slow decay, justice had no gallows, only the patient, drowning hush of moving water. There were no soldiers, no judge, no gallant speeches, only silence, and the weight of a body meant to vanish without sound. She lay face up in the shallows, the water barely reaching her chin, her arms bound at the wrist with coarse rope, frayed and swollen from the current. Her legs were tied at the ankles, twisted unnaturally, one bare foot sunk deep in river mud, the other resting gently on a jagged stone, like some tragic sculpture of defeat. Her dress, once painted with ochre and earth tones, now clung to her like a shroud, heavy and limp, streaked with blood, bruises, and the indifferent smears of algae and silt. Her hair fanned around her in the water, like black river weed, strands caught in the roots of reeds, moving gently as if stroked by unseen hands. Her eyes were closed, not in peace, not in rest, but in exhausted resistance. She had not screamed when they dragged her from the cart. She had not begged when they struck her ribs with the butt of a rifle. And she had not cried when they left her in the water, ankles roped to a sunken stump to keep her from drifting, wrists tied to force stillness. They said the current would do the rest, that no one would find her in time, that the land would claim her body and forget her name. And perhaps, had the river done what they asked of it, that would have been true. But the river did not forget her. It held her there, half dead and wholly aware, as if unwilling to carry out the task assigned to it. The water pressed against her chest, cold and sluggish, and she breathed in tiny sips, each one a gamble. Her heart beat, barely. Her skin was covered in goose flesh, turning pale beneath the dirt and the bruises, and yet her jaw remained clenched, her will wrapped tight around some ancient, defiant thread. A thread that had refused to snap, even when her body begged her to let go. She could hear them still, their words like distant echoes inside her skull. She'll be gone by morning. Let the river judge her. No need to waste a bullet on a savage horror. Words flung carelessly by men with sunburned skin and empty eyes, men who viewed mercy as weakness and murder as policy. Their boots had left deep impressions in the mud along the bank, and their wagon tracks cut a path through the sedges, heading east toward the trading post. She had listened as their voices faded, as laughter replaced brutality, as justice gave way to boredom. And then she had been alone with the river. Hours passed, maybe more. The sun slid behind the bluffs, and dusk turned the water black. Mosquitoes swarmed lazily above the surface. Bats flitted through the trees like startled memories. Coyotes howled in the distance, one, then another, then silence. She could feel the numbness crawling up her legs, the rope biting deeper where it held her to the stump, and still she did not scream. Even drowning, she had refused to give them that. She was slipping, though, slowly, inch by inch. The numbness spread like rot, not from the water, but from within, her mind unraveling into fragments. The scent of burning cedar, the weight of her mother's hands combing her hair, the voice of her brother calling her name across the canyon. She thought of the stars and the warmth of firelight and the bitter taste of medicine root. She thought of freedom, not as a place, but as a thing, fragile, breakable, stolen before it could be named. Her lips moved once, barely a whisper, not prayer, not curse, just a name. And then, without splash, without voice, without warning, someone stepped into the water. Boots first, then trousers soaked to the knee. A wide shadow, lean and tall, slicing through the river like a specter born of dusk. He made no sound, did not call her name, did not speak a word. He simply moved, as if the current parted for him, as if the river recognized his right to be there. One hand reached down, quiet as fog, and touched her shoulder. Not rough, not afraid, just contact. Just proof she had not yet become a corpse. Her eyes opened then, barely, just enough to see the shape of him, blurred and glowing in the failing light. She did not speak. She could not. But her breath caught, not in fear, in disbelief. The river had not drowned her, and now someone had come to take her back. He didn't speak, not when his hands moved to the knot at her ankles, not when the river tried to pull his sleeves back with quiet, curious laps. He moved with the calm certainty of someone who had done this before, someone who had walked into rivers that weren't supposed to return to living. His fingers were calloused, steady. The rope came free slowly, the stump resisting at first, as though reluctant to surrender its claim, before it gave a soft, almost shameful groan and let her go. She didn't help him. She couldn't. Her limbs felt like soaked linen, and her breath came in short, sharp fragments, like her body was trying to remember how to live in air again. But her eyes stayed open, watching him. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, weathered, dark, and bent slightly at one edge. She caught only glimpses, the hardened line of his jaw, the dust caked into the creases around his mouth, a faded scar trailing down from his right ear to his collarbone like a jagged memory. His eyes, when she saw them, were the color of scorched oak, burned, but still holding shape. He slipped a knife from his belt, not fast, not threatening. The rope at her wrists gave way under one slow draw across the fibers. He took her arms in both hands then, not roughly, but with a sort of quiet practicality. And as he lifted her from the shallows, the river let her go with no protest. Mud clung to her hips and knees, and her soaked dress clung to her ribs like she'd been born from the water. She sagged in his arms, not from weakness alone, but from the sheer disbelief of having survived. He carried her without urgency. The river made soft noises around their legs, lapping gently at his thighs as though reluctant to see them go. Crickets sang in dry grass above the bank. Somewhere, an owl called out, long and low, as if offering witness. When they reached the edge of the water, he knelt and laid her gently onto a patch of flattened reeds and dirt. It was dry enough. The stars were starting to break open above them, one by one, as the last of the sky's fire sank behind the cliffs. Still, he didn't speak. She studied him as best she could from where she lay, half conscious, still cold to her bones, her breath shallow but steadying. There were things she recognized about him, even if she didn't know his name. His clothes were worn but clean, the stitching handmade, the thread uneven in places. His boots had Apache patterns carved into the leather, not stolen, but aged like something long owned. A medicine pouch hung from his neck, the kind you don't wear unless you earned it. There was blood on one of his sleeves, not hers, old. He opened a small bundle wrapped in buckskin and pulled out a strip of dried meat, then a piece of clean cloth. With practiced hands, he soaked the cloth in a flask of water and began to clean her wrists, brushing away dirt and rope burns with a gentleness that made her chest tighten. He paused only once, when he turned her arm over and saw the bruise shaped like a boot heel pressed deep into the flesh of her forearm. His jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing, just kept cleaning. When he finished, he placed the meat in her hand. She stared at it, uncertain. He didn't coax her, he didn't explain. He simply sat beside her, cross-legged and still, like he had nowhere else to be. Minutes passed, maybe more, and then finally, her voice rasping through a throat that felt scoured with gravel, she asked, "Why?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the dark horizon, on the jagged silhouettes of rocks and ghost trees, standing like forgotten monuments. Finally, he said, softly but without hesitation, "Because someone should." That was all. No speech, no questions, no demands. He didn't ask her name. He didn't tell her his. He didn't say whether he was a soldier or a tracker or a drifter with too much conscience and too little purpose. But she understood in the marrow of her bones that he hadn't come by accident, that he had found her because he had meant to. And in a world where people were left to drown with no name, no trial, and no farewell, the mere fact that someone had decided to walk into the water, without a word, was louder than any promise. The cold was fading now, slowly. Her fingers began to twitch, regaining feeling. The sky stretched wide and endless above them, and she could feel the ground under her spine, dry and firm and real. She was alive, and he had come for her, That was enough, for now. They moved before dawn, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the soft deliberateness of prey learning to trust its legs again. She could walk now, barely. Her knees buckled once, and he caught her without comment. He offered no hand after that unless she asked, and she didn't. Not because she didn't need help, but because something in her demanded she try. Her body was hers again, every ache and tremor a painful declaration of continued existence. He led her away from the river without ever saying where, but the path he chose was not random. It was the kind of path you find if you've walked the land in every season. He cut diagonally through scrubland, keeping low behind dry ridges, avoiding roads and game trails alike. He moved like someone who'd learned to live unseen, by choice or necessity. She followed, her bare feet cracking dry leaves, mud drying into flakes along her calves. Her dress clung to her like smoke, stained and tattered, the color of bruised clay. It no longer whispered of identity or culture. It was just a rag now, a reminder. Every movement brought stinging pain from half-healed lashes on her back, but still, she walked. At midday, they found shade under a red rock overhang. He gathered dry grass and built a fire so small it looked like it was ashamed to burn. He handed her a canteen, tin, battered, cool to the touch. She drank greedily until her stomach cramped, then set it down with trembling fingers. He watched her, not with pity, but with quiet attentiveness, as if making sure she wouldn't vanish again. And still, he didn't ask. It was she who finally broke the silence, her voice ragged and low. They left me in the water because they were afraid to shoot me. He didn't react, didn't frown, didn't nod, just waited. She looked down at her hands. The rope burns had begun to scab over. Her fingers curled slightly when she spoke again. They said it'd be cleaner, if I died without anyone seeing. Now his eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in understanding, as if the pattern of cruelty she described was familiar, even predictable. I was taken near Dry Arrow Ridge, she added, 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. A pause. I lost count. He stirred the fire once with a twig. Your name? She hesitated. The question hung between them, like a knife left unsheathed, not threatening, but not safe either. Then, Sani. Her voice cracked slightly. It means the last one. His gaze didn't change, but something in the way he tilted his head slightly told her he understood the weight of it. And yours? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the pouch that hung at his neck and pulled out a small stone, smooth, round, black as obsidian, but dull. He held it up for a moment, then placed it gently in her palm. Saw it in a fire, he said simply. Years ago. That was all. She closed her fingers around it. The warmth of the stone surprised her. It had no name, but it had been carried, kept close, like a memory that didn't speak, but refused to fade. They moved again in the late afternoon, this time heading into the high brush, where pinon trees clung to the slopes and the air held the scent of sap and dry earth. Coyotes watched from afar, low shapes among the rocks. She leaned on a stick he'd fashioned for her, rough and uneven, but strong. By nightfall, they reached a low ravine where the remnants of a camp still lingered, ashes cold, the fire long dead, but a ring of stones and 2 half-buried footprints suggested someone had stayed recently. He knelt beside the coals and sifted through them, nodding once. Then he motioned for her to rest. As she curled beside the stone ring, her head resting against her own arms, she asked softly, "Are you taking me somewhere?" He replied without turning, "Away from where they left you." That was enough for now. She didn't ask where the end of the trail would be. Just knowing there was a trail was more than she'd had in days. No. His voice was flat. Their sleep took her slowly, not in fear this time, but in exhaustion wrapped around a new, thin hope. As her eyes closed, she felt the stone in her hand again, warmed now by her grip. Sani, the last one, but maybe not for much longer. They came across the tracks near a burned-out juniper tree, just after the rain had begun to fall in thin, hesitant threads. The soil was soft enough to remember every careless step. boot prints with sharp heels, the kind soldiers wore, pressed deep into the earth as if eager to leave a scar. There were 6, maybe 7 of them, moving in a loose, lazy formation, half circling something just out of sight. The tracks were only a day old, maybe less. He crouched low over them, his fingers brushing against the wet indentations with the reverence of someone handling the remnants of a death mask. Sani stood behind him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her body trembling, not from cold, but from the sudden realization that these were their prints, the men who had thrown her into the river, who had left her to be washed clean of existence. "They're not running," she said quietly. "Not afraid." That truth settled between them like the rain, slow, insistent, unrelenting. The men weren't hiding. They had done what they did out in the open, in the sun, without apology, because they believed no one would stop them, because no one ever had. She looked at him, his back to her, his shoulders still. "Are we following them?" "No." He stood slowly, brushing mud from his palms. "They don't matter right now." She blinked. "They tried to kill me." He turned to face her then, not harshly, not with anger, but with the full weight of who he was, whatever name the world had once given him, whatever pain carved the scar down his jaw. "And if we follow them now, you'll never get far from the water they left you in." His meaning was clear, even if the words were few. She was alive, but if she spent her strength chasing the dead end of their cruelty, she'd never stop drowning. Their names didn't matter. Their justice would never be hers. Not out here. Sani looked down at the tracks again. In the rain, they were already fading, edges blurring into the soil, shadows erased by the wet. The land didn't want to remember them. Maybe it never had. They turned away from the trail then, veering west, into terrain less traveled. The sky was bruised purple and ash gray, and the wind picked up, laced with the sour scent of old fires and distant dust storms. Every step they took away from the footprints felt like a question, and Sani didn't know yet what answer she hoped for. That night, they made camp in a hollow beneath a blackened outcrop. The stone above had once been struck by lightning, its surface split like bone cracked open by force. He said nothing as he unpacked their rations, dry roots, water, a piece of jerky hard as leather. She accepted the food without complaint, chewing slowly, methodically, like it was a ritual of the living. As the fire burned low, Sani finally spoke. "I was supposed to be forgotten." He didn't respond, but she could see his face in the flicker of flame, watching her, not like a guard, but like a witness. "They didn't use my name," she continued. "Not once, not when they took me, not when they tied me up, not even when they left me in the water. Just girl, just thing, like it made what they were doing easier." The fire cracked once, spitting a thin arc of ember into the dirt. The silence stretched. "You said they don't matter," she said, almost daring him to contradict her. "Then what does?" He didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of old cloth, unraveling it carefully. Inside was a single feather, dark with red tips. Hawk. Next to it, a jagged tooth the size of her thumb, strung on sinew, and a bundle of dried herbs wrapped with bark. "These do," he said softly, "things people tried to bury, stories they tried to forget." She studied them in the firelight, her breath slowing. "Are they yours?" "They were someone's. Now they're with me." The way he said it told her more than anything else ever could. He didn't carry them out of vanity. He carried them because the world needed someone to. Because there were stories too. Around midday, they reached a ledge overlooking a dry basin, cracked and ringed with salt like an old wound. At the center stood the remnants of a camp, burned out, collapsed, half-eaten by wind. Nothing but a few splinters of bone, a rusted tin cup, and a pole, half buried in ash. From it, the wind caught the ragged corner of a blue uniform sleeve. U.S. Cavalry. He didn't speak, just crouched, ran his fingers over the edge of the ash, and stood. His jaw was tight. Sani stood beside him. "Yours?" He shook his head. "Not for a long time." She waited, but nothing more came. Still, the air around him seemed to thicken, like the memory of fire was pressing itself into his skin again. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't finished happening inside him. That night, the fire was small, but the silence was wide. She stared into the flames, and then, almost in defiance of her own instincts, she spoke. "They used to say the desert could speak." He nodded. "They said the wind carried your lies until the rocks remembered them." Her voice was dry, rasping, but firm. "They said you couldn't bury truth out here, only delay it." He didn't answer, but he looked at her then, not with surprise, but with understanding, as if something between them had shifted, something fragile and vital, like trust. Sunny reached into the folds of her cloth and pulled out the obsidian stone he had given her that first night. She held it in her palm. "Do you know why I told you my name?" He waited. "Because I didn't want to be the girl in the river anymore. I didn't want that to be the last thing the world remembered about me." She looked away, toward the open dark of the stars. "If someone had found me later, pulled me out, I would have just been a body. One of those nameless ones. Another story people don't tell, right?" He watched her as the fire cracked low between them. "You didn't ask my name," she added, "but you gave me something first. That meant something." He tilted his head slightly. "It meant I was listening." She swallowed, hard. "They said I didn't matter." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sagebrush and old fire. "Then let them say it," he said finally. "Let them build towns on lies and ride horses over bones. Let them forget, but not you." His voice wasn't loud, but it felt like thunder wrapped in cloth. "You remember." Sandy stared into the fire for a long time. She could feel the ache in her legs, the sting of blisters and sunburn, the dull pain of old wounds trying to close. But somewhere beneath all that, beneath the skin and the fear and the silence, something else had begun to move, not healing, not yet, but remembering, holding shape against all the forces that had tried to erase her. When she slept that night, she dreamed not of water, but of earth, firm, dry, solid. She stood in it. Her footprints stayed. The wind tried to carry them off, but they remained. And in the distance, someone watched, not to follow, not to lead, but just to know that she had passed through. Still here, still walking. At dawn, the sky opened up like a wound. Pale gray bled into pink, then red, then gold, as if the desert itself had decided to remember how to feel. Sunny stood alone on a ridge above the camp, arms folded, her hair wild in the morning wind. The sunrise brushed light across her skin, but she didn't flinch. Her shadow stretched long behind her, tethering her to the earth like a cord. Below, the man packed up the camp. His motions were deliberate, careful. No wasted movement, no sound beyond the rustle of cloth and the soft clink of a canteen against stone. He didn't look up to check on her. He didn't have to. Some bond had formed between them, not built with words, not even with shared goals, but with survival. He had walked into a river when no one else would. That was enough. Sandy turned her eyes east. Somewhere beyond the low hills and broken tree lines, the men who had left her to die still moved about their lives. Maybe one of them slept easy each night. Maybe another drank to forget what he'd done. Maybe none of them remembered her face. She didn't care. Their names didn't need remembering, but hers did. She knelt and picked up a small piece of flint, white-veined and sharp-edged. She turned it over in her palm, then held it to the sun, letting the light catch in its cracks. "I am not the end," she whispered. She didn't need to say more. When she returned to the camp, the fire was out and his pack was strapped. He handed her a cloth parcel, flatbread, a few dried berries, 2 strips of meat. She nodded in thanks, tucked it into her own bundle, and they began to walk west again. The landscape shifted, the rocks grew smoother. Mesas in the distance shimmered like painted walls. They passed through a gully lined with petroglyphs, ancient lines carved into stone, depictions of hunts and storms and spirits in motion. Sunny paused there, tracing her fingers lightly over one particular symbol. A woman with outstretched arms, standing between water and fire. "She looks like me," she said softly. "She looks like all of us," he replied. They moved on. Later, They came to a canyon where the wind howled without reason. The path narrowed to a single ledge no wider than a man's boot. He crossed it first, moving with the grace of someone who had never feared falling. She followed, her toes gripping the edge, her hands brushing the rock wall, her heartbeat steady despite the drop. When she reached the other side, she felt something shift inside her. Not relief, but recognition. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the edge, not of the fall. They camped in a natural cave that night, the walls marked by soot from fires long extinguished. She found a small patch of charred wood in the corner and used it to draw on the rock. A spiral first, then a river, then a shape that only made sense to her. He didn't ask what it meant, but when she was finished, he sat beside her and handed her his blade. She looked at it, puzzled. "For you," he said. Sandy turned it over in her hands. The blade was old, honed thin, the grip wrapped in faded hide. It was a tool, not a weapon, a thing for carving, for surviving. "For what?" she asked. He looked at her then, fully, deeply. "For when the silence comes back, so you can cut through it." That night, she slept with the blade under her hand and the stone tucked near her chest. Her body was still sore, her bruises still vivid, but the ache no longer owned her. Pain had stopped being the enemy. It was just part of her now, a piece of the trail. In her dreams, she stood in the river again, but this time the water was still, clear. Her hands were untied. Her reflection looked back at her and did not flinch. She stepped forward, and the river held her up. They reached the river again. Not the same bend where she had nearly drowned, but farther upstream, where the water moved clear and slow over polished stone. No rope, no blood, just silence and sky and the hush of memory. Sonny stood at the edge, watching the current slide past her feet. The man stayed behind her, saying nothing, his presence a steady weight against the world's forgetting. She stepped into the shallows. This time, she was not dragged. She chose. Kneeling, she cupped the water in her hands, poured it over her own head, let it soak her scalp, her shoulders, her chest. Not to wash away what had happened, nothing could, but to reclaim the river, to make it hers again. She whispered her name aloud, not for him, not for the land, for herself. When she turned back, he was already walking away. No goodbye, no nod, just a man returning to whatever path the desert had loaned him. She let him go. She was not his burden, not anyone's anymore. Behind her, the river moved on, but it would not forget her, not now. And if her story moves something quiet in you, click the bell so you'll be there when the next one rises from the dust.